Good morning. Hope you all are having a good day today. If you have your books, go ahead and open up to chapter 15. This is the chapter on Africa. Now, as I mentioned in class, this is one of the chapters we were going to just kind of do a brief overview of, not because it's not important to world history, but because in order to get to chapter 17, we have to move quickly through some of these other ones that we'd otherwise like to spend a little more time on. But since I do have the opportunity to make these videos, I wanted to spend a little bit more time on it than I would have in the classroom. So, chapter 15, page 262. One of the things that we see from Africa, where it really first started coming onto the world stage, was unfortunately because of the prospect and the institution of slavery. Now, when I say on the world stage, I am not in any way discrediting the past accomplishments that have been done in Africa. Africa had been a major part of the world, especially with Egypt and the different parts going through there, and it had been a major aspect, a major portion there. But when it became really well known internationally across the world was once America was discovered and the West Indies and South America, they begin the African slave trade. Now, slavery is not something that has came around because of the discovery of the African continent and the people there. Slavery had been around since the beginning of time. Most of the time, though, slavery was something that was not based off of race. Slavery, you could become a slave for many different reasons. You could, one, be a prisoner of war. Your empire, your village, your family, whatever it may be, lost the war, therefore, you and the people you know are sold into slavery. Another reason is if you were a criminal and you get caught and the conviction is that you serve as a slave. Another very common reason was people would actually sell themselves into slavery. Now, this type of slavery was not what we would think of as Americanized slavery. I'm thinking in the American South and also in what is today the Caribbean islands and South American continent. Not that kind of slavery, but you'd more be like an indentured servant, where you would go sell yourself to somebody that you were indebted to, and then after you worked off your debt, you would be set free and be allowed to live the life the way you wanted to. But while you were in their employ, you had no rights. Well, this started out as the slave trade in Africa started out as are really starting to blossom the racial slave trade. And when most people in the world today, especially America, think of slaves, they think of the Africans and the areas surrounding that. Now, before the year 1600, only about 2,000 slaves a year came from Africa. Majority of these were because of fights or wars that took place from different Muslims or other Africans and taken to Europe for different things there. But over 180 years after 1600, so from 1600 to about 1780, the slave trade exploded to 70,000 people a year being exported out of there. The settlement of America was a major reason for this. 1609 was when Jamestown was founded in Virginia, and shortly thereafter, just a few years, the first black Africans were sold to the English colonists there by Portuguese slave traders, and it just grew from there. Now, these numbers here, the 70,000 that I mentioned per year, only represent the amount that were captured from Africa or sold from Africa on the west side of the continent and shipped mostly to the Americas, North America, Central, and South America. These do not take into account the amount of slaves that were captured on the east side, mostly by Muslim raiders and slave traders there, and then transferred to the other side of the world to the Muslim controlled areas. We don't have numbers for that. We don't know what those are. Most often, landowners in the New World would go through and they would find that they needed extra labor. They would need this extra labor mainly because of the size of the farms that they had there. Now, most of the time that they would go through there, they were not, when they first arrived, let me say that, when they first arrived, the idea of slavery was, again, not really racially based, but because of that, Europeans went and would capture Native Americans and force them to be slaves. Well, there's a problem. One, the amount of work that was required was often pretty detrimental on many of them died, but also you would have these Native Americans that would be captured and then put into slavery in the land that they grew up in. They knew this territory. So if that's true, if they knew the territory there, they could easily escape, go into the interior of the different areas, and would be free, which is a problem for the slaveholders. Now, I do want to point out as we go on here, this portion of slavery, Americans did not bring slaves to the Americas. There was no such thing as the United States of America yet. Most of these slave traders were Portuguese, there were English and Spanish and different things like that, but there is no such thing as Americans that brought the slaves to America. Once the United States happened, were slaves a major part of American history? Yes, most definitely. But again, right now with what we're talking about, it was not Americans bringing them over there. And so, what would take place here also is most of the time, it wasn't that Europeans or the white man was going into the continent of Africa and raiding these different native tribes that were there and capturing them and then hauling them off to the coast, putting them on the slave ships, and then sending them over. Most of the time, what actually developed was slave trade from Africa, from the continent, were because other tribesmen, other Africans, were selling Africans to the Europeans. A very common thing would happen like this. You would have two warring tribes. One tribe would lose, and then that losing tribe would be captured. They would be prisoners of war. Well, the Africans that won, the tribe that won, realized I could take these prisoners of war and I could use them for myself, or I could send them out to the coast, sell them to the white man, and then be very rich, very profitable situation there. And so that's what most of them did. They would go into the different areas. They would have this war. They would have this situation that was going through there, and they would go and sell them. Now, this caused some problems because you would have the tribes usually along the coast, the east coast of Africa, and the different countries, not just tribes, but countries, nations of people that live there. They would go and they would move interior into Africa and go to war with these tribes with the intention of capturing as many as possible and selling them to the slave traders on the coast. Well, as these tribes became more and more uh, good, if you will, I know that's not a nice way to look at it, but they became more successful at capturing slaves and are capturing these prisoners of war. They would trade them for gold, for resources, but also for weaponry, for guns and ammunition, which meant they would be even more powerful, therefore able to conquer more people and sell more people into it. Some people seem to think today, and I would tend to agree, that a lot of the problems that we see with different nations and different not tribal groups, but tribal groups, you could say. But some of the problems that we still see in Africa today amongst these different groups that are the fighting started way back because of the animosity developed from the slave trade and the amount of death and destruction that was caused from the more powerful tribes along the coast and how they would destroy the less powerful tribes more inland in order to sell them into slavery as they're going through there. So they would go through and they would be brought to the coast and put on slave ships. And I'm sure you've seen pictures of these here where the people were crammed into them. Well, there was something called attrition. The attrition rate is in anything in life. How much of this stuff are you going to lose while you are transporting it or while you are doing it? Think of it this way. If you have a pickup bed with mulch on the back of it, the chewed up wood that you put around plants and different things like that, and gardens, different things there. So your parents go to the nursery to get the nursery where you get plants, things like that, and you can buy the mulch. And they put the mulch in the back of your pickup truck, and then you drive home. Well, the attrition rate is how much mulch blew off the top of the truck while you were driving and is no longer usable. Well, there's a couple of different ways to counteract this attrition rate. One of them is to spend the money to buy a tarp, put it over top of the mulch, therefore it doesn't blow out. So you get better equipment so that you don't lose as much. Or you simply put more on there at the beginning so that by the time you get to your destination, most likely your home, you have not lost that much, and the amount you still have is what you need because you were expecting to lose this much, and so you have the rest of it still there. Well, they did the same thing with slaves. There was an expected attrition rate for the slaves as they crossed the Atlantic. And this was a terrible, horrible situation. Most of the time, they would build several layers of decking where you were not able to stand up straight. They would be chained side to side, and you can see illustrations of some slave ships where they would only have the room to lay down, but it wasn't comfortable because again they're all chained together. Or they would all be cramped and they would have to kneel down and stay down in that way. However, it was, there again was an expectation through disease or through starvation, through sickness, maybe even through suicide, that there would be a loss of cargo as they saw it. The word that was often used was chattel, kind of like cattle, but a CH. Chattel is what they have there. That is human cargo, is what they would call that. And so the chattel that was there, the human cargo that these slave traders saw, it said, instead of paying the money to make better equipment and to make conditions better for the slaves, we'll just cram more of these people onto the ship so that however many we lose, no big deal. We'll still have enough to make a profit when we get there. And so that's what they did, and that became a big problem there for them, and a lot of people would die from that. Now, we're not going to look at uh, much beyond that. When we do American history, we will focus more on the slave trade and things there. But what we want to focus on is Africa after slave trade had been outlawed internationally and how it grew there. And so we're on page 264 now in your book. So after the transition here, you would have these powerful nations, these powerful groups of people on the coast that would begin to rearrange how they did things. And they went and would go, and the uh, request for slaves dropped, so they had to figure out something else to supply this income. Different African tribe leaders, when they generated the wealth, took advantage later to start gathering natural resources. There was a lot of things that were really beneficial. One of them was chocolate. The cocoa pod would come to there, and the different economies that took place there. As the commerce in Africa continued, Africa and the different nations. Now, a nation doesn't mean country. Nation simply means a people group. And so these different people groups, that the usually tribal or clan based in different areas there, they begin to band together, and the Atlantic Ocean kind of helped Africa develop in a certain way. That the continent of Africa, there was one big market all along the western side of the African coast. There was another big market on the top part during the Mediterranean Sea coast that was there. And all these different ones took this place. Well, after these powerful tribes and nations of people begin to break apart and begin to break down other tribes and nations, when the slave trade goes down, things begin to crumble, new things have to happen, and new African states begin to develop out of this. And this happened just through natural means and different things there. There were others, specifically Ethiopia and Egypt, that were able to go and develop their industry. Egypt becomes very, very important for this. And so they industrialize. Egypt develops textile and cotton. They had the ability to process wood that would come and make glass and produce paper. And so they would have these, make themselves really profitable monetarily or with money. There were other modernizations that took place where some nations, not all of them, not even a lot of them, only a few, began to modernize their empires and their militaries. Because there were some very shrewd, very intelligent leaders who began to realize, if we don't modernize, when these Europeans finally do come, they will be able to wipe us out because we have hide shields and we have spears and arrows. They have guns and cannons and horses and things like that, and they wouldn't be able to compete. So there was a man named, now I'm probably going to pronounce these names incorrectly, and I apologize for that. One of them is Menelik of Ethiopia. He replaced the poor quality weapons and military accoutrements, or things of the military that he had there, with modernized instruments there. He also took his poorly trained military and trained them into a modern, even by European standards, military at that time. And when they would do this, would build this military, they actually were able to keep many European powers at bay and keep them away from there. Well, that's the coast of Africa, but Africa is a massive continent. The United States could fit inside Africa very easily. And so the coast of Africa had been a lot of the things that had been happening there, but what about the interior? How did they get in there? First of all, tribes from the interior often traded with tribes on the exterior. Interior meaning the middle or the inside, exterior being the outside. And so they began to trade there. And when they began to trade, they began to see what was available on the interior, the European powers were, and the interior tribes began to see the wealth and the prosperity that these European contacts offered them. So they began to do that. And the also Europeans purposely began exploring, trying to answer different questions that were going through there. So you had the increased trade, but the European exploration is really what encouraged the interior of Africa to be figured out, to see what was going on there. There was one man, Sir Richard Burton, who wanted to discover the source of the Nile that would come through, and finally able to figure that out. One of the most famous or actually he was a missionary explorer from England was a man named David Livingstone, and he went into Africa and was born in Scotland, arrived in 1840, and lived and traveled throughout Africa until his death 33 years later. For almost 33 years, he lived and explored in Africa. Now, he did return home to England every now and then, but most of his time was spent in Africa. He loved it so much and became so accustomed to the people that he interacted with there that at one point he was not keeping in contact with some people back home. Actually, several months went by with no word from him, which is a pretty big deal. The people were pretty concerned back home. So they sent a newspaper reporter, Henry Stanley, to find him. And Henry Stanley travels through the interior of Africa, finally goes and meets this other European, this white man there with this tribe. And when he meets him, he says a very famous quote that even today many people would recognize. He says, Dr. Livingston, or Mr. Livingston, I presume. And that became a very popular phrase there that even today, if you hear somebody say that, that's where it's from, is Mr. Livingston, I presume. He was saying there. He was a newspaper article, or newspaper author, and would write for the different ones there. One in New York especially is the one he worked for when he found Livingston down there. Now, Livingston, as he was venturing and going through different areas in Africa, did discover some pretty impressive things. Now, when I say discover, I simply mean that he was the first European to see it, the first European to discover it. Obviously, these people that had lived there for so many generations, hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, the African tribes, and I don't know the names of all of them, but they were there for a very long time. They had discovered them many, many, many years before this. I understand that. And I'm not trying to go through and start a discussion here about who discovered it, but as the first European to discover something called the Victoria Falls, and he named them after the Queen of England at the time. These massive, huge waterfall that was there in the Central Africa. And it was crazy how big it was. And I'm not going to try to pronounce the African name for it, but obviously the Africans had seen it before, and they called it the smoke that thunders. And so, if you go and look up videos online or see the picture there in your book, you will see that it looks like there's smoke where the water goes over the edge. But that's the mist that is there from the churning water that develops. And they called it that. Now, David Livingstone, as I mentioned, did die in 1837. But he loved Africa so much that, and the people of Africa that he worked with loved him so much that when he left, when he was going to go be buried back home, they actually buried his heart in Africa as a symbolic gesture of saying that this is where his heart was, this is where he was loved, and the territory that he loved there. David Livingstone, though, was not the only missionary. One of the big pushes in in African history was the European and American missionaries that would go there. You see the map there on page 267. The Muslims for generations, hundreds of years, had controlled the Sahara Desert and north, And then underneath of that was the African tribal animistic religions, and then a couple of areas of Christian religion there. Now, when it says Christian, it does not necessarily mean born again believers. This could be Catholic, this could be Anglican, this could be born again, but keep that in mind. And then you see the different inroads that they were striving to make on the map there on page 267. Not only was the African uh, what was Africa developing through industry and technology, but they were also developing educationally and going through what they were doing. There was one man specifically, Samuel Crowther, his name would be. He would change his name to eventually. And he had been born in Nigeria. And while he was there, some Muslim raiders had invaded his town, tried to capture the entire village that was there, sold it to Portuguese slave traders, but at this point, the international slave trade was illegal. Thankfully, some British ships intercepted the Portuguese ship, freed the slaves, and he would later become an incredible minister back to the people of Africa. So much so that the Oxford University in England would give him as a doctorate of divinity, which is a pretty big deal that they would recognize somebody like this. So a huge achievement there. So they would go through there, and you would have the colonization of Africa. Portugal, as I mentioned them a couple of times, is one of the first people to start colonizing it, not because they wanted massive land holdings, but because they wanted the ports where the slaves were being brought to the coast and going out. They would not have large territorial gains in Africa. Portugal would not. But they would control the ports of the slave trade, so they became very wealthy from that. Britain would go through and expand over time, especially after uh, losing the American colonies after the War of Independence and the Revolutionary War. So they would lose that, so they would begin colonizing Africa, pushing a big interest in there, and began to do that, especially in Egypt and South Africa, that we know the territory there. But then France also wanted and needed to colonize in their minds. In order to be a world power, one of the things you had to have was overseas colonies. And France had lost a lot of their colonies during the Revolution and during some wars with Germany that they had lost. And so they lost almost all of their overseas territories, and so therefore they looked weak at least they saw themselves as weak, and other nations saw them as weak because you don't have any overseas colonies. So they began going through. And they had this great idea. And this begins to show the very arrogant and Eurocentric ideas that these people had. And America is often blamed for these as well, and we have had some things like this that we've done. But France was wanting overseas colonies so much that they literally went to war with the nation of Algeria that was there, trying to conquer them in 1830, and took them several years to win this. So they go, they fight this war, several years, many people die, lots of money is used on this, and when they get it, they're like, oh, look, we have a colony now. Well, you have that because you went and started a war because of your greed and your pride. And so there was a big change there and a big difference that would happen in the mindsets. We're going to go here in just a second and look at the effect of imperialism and what that would have on Africa. The part here that we're going to look at is the effect that imperialism would have on Africa. For those who don't remember what imperialism is the idea or mindset by a country, by a nation, by an empire, that they want more and more territory. You can actually understand that when somebody gets powerful, what do they want? More power. And that's what would begin to happen here with Africa. They would go through the Europeans and they came up with an idea. Between the 1880s and 1910, they began to look at the continent of Africa instead of independent, able people to rule this. They saw it as an opportunity for them to scoop up and take a bunch of territories for themselves. So they would begin to do that. And what happened here was that the French had wanted to make a railroad that went below the Sahara or sub-Saharan Africa. The British and Portuguese had laid claim to this area, and so a war could develop because the British and the Portuguese both said this territory is ours, and now the French are trying to come through to put a railroad through there. So whose territory is it? So the Europeans, they did not want to go through and fight a war amongst themselves. So they looked and says, how can we help the African people? Now, the Europeans, they did not see themselves as being cruel or vindictive or unjust with what they were doing. They honestly had several, in their mind, good reasons and motives for doing this. They did not see themselves as being unjust. But their motives, when become clear, we could see why they were wanting to do it and what they wanted. And there are four main reasons that the people in Europe believed that they could go and do this. First of all was economic. With the Industrial Revolution booming and things being developed, what was needed the most was raw material. Raw material, things that you can make stuff out of. You think the different ores that are there, the iron ore and copper and tin. You would think the wood and just gold and silver, all this stuff that nations need to survive in this more modern era that they were beginning to come into. And Africa had all of that. So if you go and control a colony, control a territory, guess who gives you their stuff? That comes straight to you. You, as a nation, as a country, don't have to pay your colonies to send you raw material because it's your colony. You already own it in their minds. So they wanted to do this. And so they would increase their trade back to the home countries. Another reason was nationalism, which is very similar to imperialism that I just talked about a few moments ago. But there's nationalism. The nation wanted to look powerful. You wanted your nation to look good. Imperialism is where you want your empire to be bigger and bigger, but nationalism is similar to patriotism, but it's a little bit different there. And so the nationalism would go through there. Germany and Italy, which are countries that we talk about all the time, we refer to them most often when dealing with Europe, different things like that. We say that Rome was in Italy. Well, Germany and Italy had actually only been countries, official countries named Italy, named Germany, unified and centralized for about 10 years. And they're looking around and seeing all these other countries that have been there for hundreds of years: Spain, Portugal, France, Britain, all these places there, and they have overseas colonies. Well, remember, what do you need to be cool, to be special, to be powerful in the eyes of your European neighbors? Overseas colonies. So where's one of the last places able to be colonized? Africa. So they start doing that. Germany and Italy, amongst other nations, begin to try to snatch up parts of Africa that are there. And they begin to go do this. France, again, I already mentioned them. They've lost several wars with Britain. They were still trying to somewhat recover psychologically and different things there from the wars of Napoleon and different things that happened there. And so finally, they were trying to scoop up some territory as well. But a third reason was religious. And there were some honest people that looked at it and says, you know what, they are these African tribesmen, they are pagan, they looked at them as going to die without God. And so they saw this as a problem. So the missionaries, they said, if we can go colonize these areas, then we can teach them about the Lord, then they go to heaven. But one of the big problems was most of these places, these countries, did not want to simply evangelize. They wanted to Europeanize. They saw, and this leads into the fourth reason, they saw the African nations, tribes, and peoples as a lesser human, in need of the white man to help these heathens. And they actually called it the white man's burden. It is our burden as white Europeans to go and help these backward heathens with their life. And the fourth reason that I said here is racism, where they saw themselves as better than the others. The Europeans saw themselves as more powerful than the Africans. They saw themselves as more highly developed. We talked about Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest. One of the very, very, very racist ideas and mindsets that came from his teachings of survival of the fittest was this idea that Africans were subhuman, that they were not as advanced intellectually, not just economically, but like I said, intellectually. They are not as intelligent as us because they are not white, and we need to go make sure that we can help them be this way. There were many, many different Africans that were studied by European scientists as being the missing link of being closer to the ape than they were because the Africans were black and the Europeans were white. So obviously the black people are closer to our apes ancestors. They would capture and kidnap these African tribesmen sometimes and put them in zoos as the missing link right alongside the lions and the tigers and the bears. And then there would be other parts that they would put there and say, this is the missing link. They would have them on display. Some of them, you can read stories about this and they're heartbreaking. Eventually, some of these zoo displays that they would put on, the individuals would kill themselves because of how degrading it was to be treated as an animal. So, how did this happen? Well, this became known as the scramble for Africa or the race for Africa. And eventually, when this scramble was all done, there would be three phases that it would go through, and only two African nations, Liberia and Ethiopia, would be able to resist the occupation of the European powers. Phase one dealt with the European rulers all met, different uh, groups got together, and they said, okay, what we need to do is begin to sign treaties with the African nations. And these treaties could say several different things. They were either trade negotiation deals, they could be military protection. We'll protect you from your enemies, and all these different things here. But most of the time, these were very empty promises that were simply written to get their foot in the door so that they would be able to take over the country. There was a quote given by a British agent of one of the major British, it's called the British East Africa Company. And he said, quote, no man, if he understands, would sign it. And to say that a savage king has been told that he cedes all rights to them, the company, in exchange for nothing, is obvious untruth. If he had been told the truth that the British East African Company would protect him against his enemies and share his wars as an ally, he has been told a lie, for the company has no idea of doing any such thing and no force to do it if they were wished. End quote. So basically, this agent of the British East Africa Company is saying if these African leaders knew what they were signing, they would never sign it. They're being lied to. Our company has no intention whatsoever of helping them during wars or protecting them if the enemies attack. Not even a little. A lot of times, actually, the people that were signing these documents, the African leaders, couldn't read English or whatever language it was, German, Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese. They couldn't read it. So they didn't know what they were signing. They were just signing it and told that they would get these great military allies that were there. Sometimes even they would, different groups, and I will mention this a little bit later, but one of the European powers would say, hey, I'll defend you against your enemies, but at the same time, they're giving money and supplies to their enemies. So that was phase one, signing documents and treaties with the different people groups of Africa. Phase two, the European leaders now met in Berlin, Germany, at the what would become known as the Berlin Conference to divide up and decide who gets Africa and who gets what part. There's a really good map that shows this on page 270, where they sat down with rulers and with maps that said, Portugal, I want this. Spain wants this. Belgium wants this. Germany, Italy, Spanish, French, British. They all want these different territories, and they would divide it up. Now, what's interesting here is you look at that map on page 270, some of these borders of these different territories are obviously along natural geographic lines, a river, a coastline, a mountain range, something like that. But there are others that are straight lines. And the European powers could not care any less if there were African tribes that were separated or divided through these lines. They didn't care if they were mashing together different tribes that had been enemies for generations. Wasn't at all what they cared about. Obviously, the Africans had some reactions to this, and there were three main ones that they could have here. One of them was is they capitulated. They immediately would realize we can't fight the Africans, or we can't fight the Europeans. Okay, this territory is yours. Another saw them as protection. They're like, yes, we'll do it, and we will serve you. Just put our ruler, keep him in charge here. But again, most of the time, the European powers had no intention of keeping these promises. And the final one was confrontation. Many did resist the European invasion at first, but with the difference in technology and warfare abilities between the European powers and the African powers, many Africans did not stand a chance. Not only did they have the flintlock muskets that had been used all the way back in 1776, and this is almost the year 1900, so these flintlocks have been around, maybe not as old as the American Revolution, but definitely the same style as the American Revolution rifle. And the African powers saw that the Europeans had something called the Maxim gun, which is the early edition of the machine gun. So even if they had rifles or muskets, they couldn't stand up against the Maxim guns. There were many different consequences to this imperialism that developed here. There were some political ones. European powers either killed or captured the rebellious leaders of the territory that they just stole. They also did form new nations were formed. But unfortunately, many of these nations were formed without consent or knowledge of the Africans, and different people groups were put together there. You did have some somewhat beneficial. There were some policies and procedures that were put into place that did help the nations to industrialize and different things there. In other areas, there were professional armies trained by the Europeans that were able to defend themselves a little bit more. Africa did get a lot of infrastructure, meaning roads and communication, railroads that helped out there. But on the negative side, there was a lot of, on the economic things that hurt. African animals were beginning to be hunted on large numbers there for sport. Socially, there was growth of the African people that began to take place there because the just the help from the European powers to be able to go there. But they also went through and created large gaps economically between different peoples. The Europeans, when they developed these cities that would go through here, the rich and wealthy would live along the coasts most often, whereas the poor, for lack of a better term, and rural areas were much more interior. And these major discrepancies often would lead to hardships and bitter rivalries between these two groups. So, as I mentioned, a little bit of a longer video than I intended to make, but I wanted to spend some time looking at this because the ideas and the problems that would develop from Africa would be part of the things that would lead us into World War I. There is no homework assigned on this chapter except you do need to do in your activities manual, just so that I know you guys are paying attention, watching the videos. You do need to do, it was in chapter 15, and there is a map on page 123. You need to do that map there. The map on page 270 should help you a lot, but that is your homework for this chapter. That's the only thing there is just a map on page 123. Have a good day.